I checked my gear one more time at the Maroon Bells trailhead, running through the mental checklist that had become routine after 2 summers of guiding. First aid kit, emergency radio, extra water, whistle, everything in its place. Behind me, 8 tourists gathered around the information board, their excited chatter mixing with the sound of car doors slamming as more visitors arrived. "So we can definitely get to the lake and back before lunch, right?" asked a woman in brand new hiking boots that probably cost more than I made in a week. "I have a spa appointment at 3. I forced a smile. "We'll have plenty of time, Mrs. Chen. The trail's about 4 miles round trip." Mickey Reese, the software developer I'd taken out twice before, was already pulling out his phone to take pictures of the parking lot. Everything was data to him. "Hannah, I was thinking, wouldn't it be more efficient if we split into smaller groups? Some people want to take photos, others just want to hike fast. We could cover more ground." "No." The word came out sharper than I intended. I softened my tone. "Sorry, but we stay together. That's rule number 1. Mickey's eyebrows shot up behind his glasses. "But what's the real reason behind? Buddy system is mandatory." I cut him off, shouldering my pack. "No exceptions." Across the parking lot, Grayson Powell was doing his own gear check with his team. He caught my eye and gave me that knowing look, the one that said he'd heard this speech 1,000 times too. His crew looked more relaxed, laughing at something he'd just said. Grayson had this way of making the rules sound like friendly suggestions instead of life or death requirements. It drove me nuts. "Everyone ready?" I called out, pulling my group's attention away from their phones and water bottles. "Remember, we stay together, we stay on the trail, and we don't go near the water alone. Those aren't suggestions." The hike started well enough. The morning air was crisp, and the aspen leaves were just beginning to turn yellow at the edges. My group found a comfortable pace, with Mickey predictably asking questions about everything from trail maintenance to wildlife patterns. I answered what I could while keeping my eyes on the path ahead, watching for anything out of place. That's when I saw them. Fresh scratches on a pine tree about 20 feet up the trail. Deep gouges in the bark that definitely weren't there yesterday when I'd done my route check. They looked almost like claw marks, but no bear I knew could reach that high. The scratches were too careful, too evenly spaced. I froze in place. "Everything okay?" Mickey appeared at my elbow, following my gaze to the tree. "What are you looking at?" "Just checking the trail conditions," I said, moving past the tree quickly. "Keep up with the group." But I couldn't stop thinking about it. In 2 years of guiding, I'd learned to spot things that were out of place. Changes in the landscape. Signs that something had come through. Ted had taught me that. Always watch for what's different, what's fresh, what breaks the usual pattern. Those scratches were definitely recent. We moved well up the trail, my group talking about their work and holiday plans while I watched the forest around us. Everything looked normal until we got to Cathedral Lake. The lake stretched out in front of us, perfectly still and reflecting the peaks that gave this place its name. My tourists immediately scattered to the shoreline, pulling out cameras and phones. I was about to remind them about staying together when I saw it. A backpack, sitting near the water's edge about 50 yards from where we'd stopped. It was still damp. I felt my stomach drop. There hadn't been any rain in 3 days. The morning dew had burned off hours ago, but that pack looked like someone had just pulled it out of the lake. "Mrs. Chen, could you keep everyone together for a few minutes?" I called out, trying to keep my voice casual. "I need to check something." I walked over to the abandoned pack, my boots crunching on the rocky shore. It was a blue and gray hiking backpack, expensive looking. The same brand that missing hiker from last month had been carrying when he disappeared. Same size, same color scheme. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my radio. "Ranger Hudson, this is Hannah Cortez. I'm at Cathedral Lake with a group, and I've found an abandoned backpack. Looks like it might be related to the missing person case from last month." The radio made a crackling sound. "Copy that, Hannah. Can you describe the pack?" I gave her the details while keeping an eye on my group. They were still taking photos, completely unaware of what I'd found. Mickey was crouched by the water's edge, probably checking the mineral content or something equally obsessive. "I'll head up there," Aubrey's voice came through the static. "Don't let anyone touch it, and keep your group away from that area." "Copy." I clipped the radio back to my belt and walked back to my tourists, my mind spinning. Someone else had gone missing. Someone else had left their pack behind. Someone else who'd probably broken one of Ted's rules and paid the price. "All right, everyone, let's move away from the shoreline," I announced. "We'll take our break up on that ridge instead." "But the lighting is perfect here," protested the spa appointment woman. "The lighting will be better from higher up," I lied smoothly. "Trust me." As I led my group away from the lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest felt too quiet, too still. Even Mickey seemed to sense something, looking back over his shoulder as we climbed toward the ridge. I thought about Ted's rules. Stay together, stay on the trail, don't go near the water alone. Someone had broken at least one of those rules, and now their pack was sitting by Cathedral Lake, soaked with water that shouldn't exist. The mountains took another life. I kept my group moving down the trail, but my eyes stayed glued to Grayson's group above us until they vanished around a bend. Francisco Tucker, the same guy who'd been lost 2 weeks ago, wandering alone near Devil's Thumb without any gear. Now he was just another tourist in Grayson's group, that ridiculous Hawaiian shirt bright as a warning flag against the gray sky. "Hannah, what's that sound?" Mrs. Chen had stopped walking and was looking toward the tree line where that laughter had come from. It had died away now, but the memory of it still made my shoulders tense. "Probably just other hikers," I said, though we both knew that wasn't true. The sound had been too sharp, too gleeful, like someone finding something funny that shouldn't be funny at all. Mickey showed up next to me, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Actually, I don't think that was a human making that sound. The pitch was off and the way the sound carried." "Mickey," I cut him off harder than I meant to. "We need to keep moving." Behind us, Aubrey was photographing the backpack from different angles, her movements quick and professional. She'd pulled on latex gloves and was being careful not to disturb anything, but I could see the stress in her shoulders. This wasn't her first abandoned pack this season. The storm clouds were building fast now, the way they do in the mountains when you're not paying attention. What had been wisps of white an hour ago were now dark gray masses rolling over the peaks. I could smell rain coming. "Everyone, we're picking up the pace," I announced. "Weather's moving in." My group grumbled but followed along, their earlier excitement killed by the approaching storm and my obvious stress. Mrs. Chen kept looking back toward where we'd heard the laughter, and even Mickey had stopped asking questions, which was probably a first. We'd made it maybe another quarter mile when Grayson's voice carried down from above us. "Hannah, wait up!" I turned to see his group coming down fast, too fast for the terrain. Grayson was in the lead, his usual easy smile replaced by something much tighter. Behind him, his 8 tourists looked confused and a little spooked. "Change of plans," he called out as they caught up to us. "We're heading down early." I looked around his group quickly, 7 tourists now. Francisco Tucker was gone. "Where's your 8th?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Grayson's jaw twitched. "What 8th?" "The guy in the Hawaiian shirt. Francisco Tucker. I don't know what you're talking about." But his eyes said otherwise. There was something there, a flicker of confusion or maybe fear. "I've got 7 clients today, same 7 I started with." Mickey's head turned back and forth like he was following a tennis ball. "Actually, I definitely counted 8 people when you walked by us earlier. There was a guy at the back of your group wearing—" "Mickey, not now," I snapped. The first fat raindrops started hitting the trees around us, making that hollow sound that means you've got maybe 5 minutes before the real downpour starts. Aubrey showed up beside us, the abandoned backpack now sealed in an evidence bag. "We need to get everyone down," she said. "This storm's gonna be bad." As if to prove her point, thunder rolled across the valley, deep and threatening. My tourists moved closer together, their vacation adventure suddenly feeling less like fun. Combined groups, I decided. Grayson, you take point. I'll bring up the rear. We started down the trail in a loose line, 15 people moving as fast as safety allowed on the increasingly slippery rocks. I kept counting heads, 7 of mine, 7 of Grayson's, plus Aubrey, 14 total. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. The rain started coming down hard as we hit the steeper section of trail. Not the gentle mountain shower that tourists love to photograph, but the kind of downpour that turns trails into streams and makes every step dangerous. I was focused on keeping everyone upright when Mrs. Chen grabbed my arm. "There," she whispered, pointing into the trees. I saw him again. I looked where she was pointing, but only saw pine trees and darkness. Saw who? The man in the bright shirt. He was just standing there watching us. My blood went cold. I pulled out my radio, but the static was awful in the storm. "Aubrey," I called ahead. "We need to move faster." She looked back, saw something in my face, and nodded. "Everyone, we're going to pick up the pace. Watch your footing, but let's get down to the parking lot." The next 20 minutes were a blur of rain and careful steps, and me constantly checking the trees around us. Every shadow looked like it might be Francisco Tucker. Every sound could have been footsteps keeping up with our group. We finally reached the trailhead parking lot as the storm hit with full force. My tourists ran for their cars, vacation over, while Grayson's group crowded under the information shelter. Aubrey was already on her radio, trying to reach the ranger station through the static. I cornered Grayson by his truck. "Tell me about Francisco Tucker." "I already told you. I don't know anyone by that name." "Grayson." I stepped closer, rain dripping off my hat. "I saw him with your group. Mickey saw him. Mrs. Chen saw him in the trees. So either you're lying to me or something really weird is going on." He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the storm. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller. "I remember starting with 8 people this morning. I remember doing the head count at the trailhead. But when I try to picture that 8th person..." He shook his head. "It's like trying to remember a dream." The rain beat down on the roof of his truck. In the distance, lightning brightened the peaks where we'd just been hiking. "What do you remember about him?" I pressed. "Hawaiian shirt. That's it. Everything else is just gone." Grayson looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked scared. "Hannah, what the hell is happening up there?" I thought about Ted's rules. Stay together, stay on the trail, don't go near the water alone. Rules that everyone thought were just common sense safety measures. But what if they were something else? What if they were protection against something that shouldn't exist? "I don't know," I said, "but I think we need to talk to Ted." I stared at the computer screen in the guide station, my wet hair still dripping from the storm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while Grayson pulled up his booking system, his fingers dancing across the keyboard like he'd done this 1,000 times before. "See? Francisco Tucker booked online this morning at 6:30 a.m. He turned the laptop toward me, pointing at the screen. "Paid in full, emergency contact listed, the whole thing." I leaned closer, checking the reservation details. Something felt off about it, but I couldn't figure out what. 6:30 this morning? That's strange. People don't usually book same day for Maroon Bells. We're packed solid through October. Maybe he got lucky with a cancellation. Grayson shrugged, but I caught the slight tension in his voice. "Happens sometimes." "Grayson, I need to tell you something." I pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "I've seen Francisco before. 2 weeks ago, up near Devil's Thumb. He was alone, no gear, claiming he was lost." "So? Lots of people get turned around up there. He wasn't lost." The words came out harder than I intended. He knew exactly where he was, and when I offered to help him get back to the trailhead, he just walked away, into the forest, like he belonged there. Grayson was quiet for a moment, staring at his laptop screen. Hannah, you're starting to sound a little paranoid. Am I? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the files Aubrey had shared with all the guides last month. Look at these missing persons reports. 3 different hikers, all disappeared in the last 6 months. I showed him the photos. David Chen went missing in June near Crater Lake. Last seen talking to a man in a bright shirt. Maria Santos disappeared in July on the 4-pass loop. Witnesses said she was hiking with someone who didn't match her registered group. And James Morrison, the guy whose pack we found today, his girlfriend said he mentioned meeting a friendly local who offered to show him some off-trail spots. Grayson's face had gone pale. That doesn't mean... Our radios came to life, cutting him off. Aubrey's voice came through the static, tense and professional. All guides, this is Ranger Hudson. I need Hannah and Grayson to respond if you're available. I grabbed my radio. This is Hannah. Grayson's here too. What's going on? I've been examining the backpack you found today. There's something you need to know about. Can you meet me at the ranger station? We're at the guide station now. What did you find? A pause. There's a journal in the pack. The handwriting doesn't match our missing hiker's writing samples from his registration forms. And the entries, they're not what you'd expect from someone lost in the wilderness. My stomach dropped. What kind of entries? Detailed observations about guide routes, schedules, which trails are most popular on which days. The person who wrote this was studying your patterns, all of your patterns. Grayson and I locked eyes. He wasn't dismissing my worries anymore. There's more, Aubrey continued. The final entry is dated yesterday. It just says, almost time to go home. I was already reaching for my jacket. We're coming to you. Actually, stay put. I'm heading your way. There's something else we need to check. The radio went quiet. Grayson stared at his laptop screen like it might bite him. Pull up Francisco's reservation again, I said. His fingers moved across the keyboard, but then he stopped, made a face, tried again. That's weird. The system's running slow. But I could see the screen from where I sat. The booking system had loaded just fine. The problem was what it displayed. Grayson, just give me a second. The search function is being glitchy. Grayson, look at the screen. He looked. His face went white. The reservation list for today's Maroon Bells tour showed 7 clients, 7 names, 7 confirmation numbers, 7 payment records. Francisco Tucker wasn't there. Not in today's bookings, not in the cancellation log, not anywhere in the system. But I just showed you. He clicked frantically through different screens. It was right here. I saw it. You saw it. I had seen it. 5 minutes ago, Francisco Tucker's reservation had been right there on the screen, complete with booking time and payment confirmation. Now it was gone like it had never been there in the first place. Check your email confirmations, I said, though I already knew what we'd find. Grayson opened his email. The automatic confirmations for today's tour showed 7 clients, the same 7 names currently in the system. No Francisco Tucker. This doesn't make sense. His voice was barely a whisper. I remember taking his money this morning. I remember checking him in. I thought about Mrs. Chen spotting Francisco in the trees during the storm, about how confused Grayson got when I asked him about his 8th client, about the way Francisco stared at me near Devil's Thumb, like he was keeping some kind of secret. We need to find him, I said, standing up. Right now. Find who? According to this, he was never here. That's exactly why we need to find him. I grabbed my headlamp and emergency pack while Grayson tossed his gear into his truck. The parking lot at the guide station felt different at night, too quiet, with dark patches that seemed to shift when I wasn't watching them directly. You sure about this? Grayson asked as we climbed into his truck. Claire's probably fine. Maybe her radio died. Her last check-in was at 6. It's almost midnight. I buckled my seatbelt and tried to ignore how my hands were shaking. And after everything that happened today with Francisco, Grayson started the engine. Right, the guy who apparently never existed. The drive to Crater Lake took 40 minutes on winding mountain roads. Grayson's headlights cut through the darkness, showing pine trees that crowded close to the asphalt. Neither of us talked much. I kept thinking about Francisco's reservation vanishing from the computer, about those journal entries in that backpack, about the way he'd stared at me near Devil's Thumb like he was expecting something. The full moon hung overhead, bright enough to send light streaming through the truck windows. When we finally reached the Crater Lake trailhead, Grayson's truck was the only vehicle in the small dirt parking area. "That's weird," I said, checking my watch. "Claire's group was supposed to camp here tonight. Where are their cars?" Grayson pulled out his phone and tried calling Claire again. Straight to voicemail, same as the last 5 times. We grabbed our packs and started up the emergency access trail, a narrow path that maintenance crews used to reach the backcountry campsites. Our headlamps made dancing circles of light on the rocky ground ahead. The forest felt way too quiet. No owl calls, no rustling in the brush, just our footsteps and breathing. "There," Grayson said after about 20 minutes of hiking. "I see light." Through the trees ahead, a faint glow flashed near the river. We picked up our pace, branches catching at our jackets as we pushed through the bushes. We found Claire sitting on a fallen log about 10 feet from the water's edge. She had a small flashlight in her lap, but she wasn't using it, just staring at the rushing stream like she was watching something we couldn't see. "Claire!" I called out. She turned toward us slowly, blinking like she was coming out of a deep sleep. "Hannah? What are you doing here?" "Looking for you." I knelt down beside her, studying her face in the beam of my headlamp. Her pupils looked normal, no signs of head injury, but something was off about her expression. "Your group was supposed to check in hours ago." "My group?" Claire looked confused. We were setting up camp. The tourists wanted to see the stars, so we stayed up late. And then..." She trailed off, pressing her fingers to her temples. "I can't remember how I got down here." Grayson swept his flashlight across the clearing. "Where is everyone else? Where are the tents?" "Up at the designated camping area, I think. Maybe a quarter mile that way." Claire pointed vaguely upstream. "I must have wandered off. That's not like me." I looked down at her boots. They were completely dry, even though she was sitting right next to a stream that had been running high all week from recent snowmelt. If she'd hiked down here from the camping area, she would have had to cross the water at least twice. "Claire, how did you get to this side of the river?" She stared at her boots like she was seeing them for the first time. I crossed it, didn't I? There's a log bridge upstream." But I knew this area well. There was no log bridge. The only way across was through the water, and it was running too fast and deep to cross without getting completely soaked. "We need to move away from the water," I said, remembering Ted's 3rd rule. "Right now." "Why?" Claire asked, but she let me help her stand. "Just trust me." We'd taken maybe 3 steps back from the river when Grayson grabbed my arm. "Hannah, look." I followed where he was staring to the middle of the stream, where a large boulder stuck up from the rushing water. A figure stood on top of it, perfectly balanced even though the rock's surface was wet. Francisco Tucker, still wearing that ridiculous Hawaiian shirt, watched us with an expression I couldn't figure out. Sad, maybe, or tired. "You follow the old man's rules so well, Hannah," he said, his voice carrying crystal clear over the sound of rushing water. "But you never asked why he knows them." My throat felt dry. "What do you want?" Francisco tilted his head slightly like he was thinking about the question. "Want is a human concept. I do what needs to be done." "The missing hikers," I said. "You took them. They chose to leave the paths they were meant to follow." His voice held no anger, just a kind of ancient patience. "Every choice has consequences." Claire made a small sound beside me, like she was remembering something. Her fingers tightened around my arm. "Where are they now?" Grayson demanded. "What did you do with them?" Francisco stared at him for a long moment. They serve the mountain now, as they should have from the beginning, as all humans should, if they wish to walk here. Before any of us could react, Francisco stepped backward off the rock. I expected to hear a splash, see him come up downstream, something. Instead, he just disappeared into the dark water without disturbing it at all. No ripples, no sound, like he'd never been there. Claire let out a sharp breath, her whole body jerking like she'd been shocked. Oh God, I remember now. Remember what? I asked. The group is fine, they're asleep in their tents up at camp. But Francisco... She looked toward the water where he'd disappeared. He was with us earlier, not part of the group, just there, like he belonged, and when it got dark, he walked into the forest. And you followed him, I said. Claire nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. I don't know why, I just felt like I had to. He took me down here to the river, and then he said... She paused, trying to remember. He said I wasn't ready yet, that I still had choices to make. The three of us stood there in the moonlight, looking at the water where Francisco had been. The river rushed past like nothing had happened, but I could feel something watching us from the darkness beyond our flashlights. We need to get back to Claire's group, I said finally. Make sure everyone's accounted for. As we started hiking upstream toward the camping area, Claire walking between Grayson and me, I couldn't stop thinking about Francisco's words. Ted knew the rules, but why? How long had this been going on? And what did Francisco mean when he said the missing hikers served the mountain now? The moon followed us through the trees, bathing everything in silver light that made the familiar forest look like somewhere else entirely, somewhere older, where different rules applied and humans were just visitors who'd forgotten their place. I pulled my truck up to Ted's cabin just as the first light started creeping over the peaks. The old log structure sat tucked into a grove of aspens about 3 miles off the main trail, accessible only by a maintenance road that most people didn't know existed. Smoke curled from the chimney, and I could smell coffee brewing even before I got out of the truck. Grayson's vehicle was already there, parked next to Aubrey's official ranger truck. Through the cabin's single window, I could see them sitting around Ted's kitchen table, their faces serious in the lamplight. Ted opened the door before I could knock. Figured you'd be along soon enough, he said, stepping aside to let me in. Coffee's fresh. The cabin's interior was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd lived alone in the mountains for 40 years. A few pieces of furniture, everything built for use rather than looks. Walls covered with topographic maps marked in red ink. A wood stove provided the only heat, and the smell of pine smoke mixed with coffee created something that should have been comforting, but just made me more on edge. Hannah, Aubrey said, looking up from her mug. Ted's been telling us some interesting things. I poured myself coffee from the pot on the stove and sat down in the remaining chair. About Francisco? Ted nodded slowly. About a lot more than Francisco. Grayson looked like he hadn't slept. His usual easy confidence was completely gone, replaced by something I'd never seen in him before. Real fear. Hannah, what Ted's saying, it can't be true. 2 days ago, I would have agreed with you. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug. But impossible things keep happening. Ted walked over to an old filing cabinet and pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. 40 years ago, I was part of a geological survey team working these mountains. We were mapping mineral deposits, checking for potential mining sites. He sat back down, placing the folder in front of him. 3 weeks into the project, someone went missing. A team member? Aubrey asked. Local guide we'd hired. Name was Jim Clearwater. Ute knew these mountains better than anyone. One morning he just wasn't in camp. No tracks leading away, no sign of struggle, nothing. Ted opened the folder and pulled out a yellowed incident report. We searched for 5 days. Found his pack by a stream about 2 miles from camp, completely dry even though it had rained the night before. My stomach dropped. just like the pack we found yesterday." "Exactly like that." Ted's weathered fingers traced the edge of the old paper. But Jim wasn't the last. Over the next month, we lost 2 more people. Both times they'd been working alone in areas we'd been told to avoid by the local tribal council. "Told to avoid why?" I asked. Ted stayed quiet for a moment, looking down at his coffee. "The council said those places belonged to the old ones, the people who were here before people, if that makes sense. We figured it was just old beliefs, maybe some sacred sites we needed to respect." Aubrey leaned forward. "But it wasn't just old beliefs." "No." Ted pulled out another document. This one a hand-drawn map covered in symbols I didn't recognize. After the 3rd disappearance, I started paying attention. Really paying attention. The areas where people vanished weren't random. They formed a pattern, like boundaries around specific locations. He spread the map on the table. Red X marks dotted the paper, connected by lines that formed rough circles around certain peaks and valleys. I started noticing other things too. Sounds in the forest that didn't match any animal I knew. Tracks that appeared overnight and disappeared by morning. Trees marked in ways that looked deliberate but didn't match any human trail-blazing system. Grayson shook his head. "You're talking about something that doesn't exist, am I?" Ted reached into the folder again and pulled out a photograph. Black and white, clearly old, showing a group of men in work clothes standing near what I recognized as Maroon Lake. This was taken in 1915, railroad survey crew. I looked at the photo. 12 men stood for the camera, some gripping surveying equipment, others just waiting with their hands tucked in their pockets. Behind them, the well-known peaks of the Maroon Bells stretched into a clear sky. "Look at the background," Ted said quietly. "Left side, near the tree line." I squinted at the photo. There, barely visible among the aspens, stood a figure that hadn't posed with the group. A man in what looked like a light-colored shirt with a pattern I couldn't quite make out. "That's not possible," I whispered. "The shirt pattern's different, but the cut's the same. Same height, same build." Ted tapped the photo with his finger. "I've got 3 more pictures from different decades. 1923, 1941, 1967. Same figure, always in the background, always watching." Aubrey grabbed the photo and brought it up to the lamp. "This could be anyone. The picture's too blurry to see any details." "Could be," Ted agreed. "But I know what I've seen up there. And after 40 years of following the rules, I know why they work." "What rules?" I asked, though I already knew. "Stay together. Stay on the trail. Don't go near water alone." Ted's voice carried the weight of decades. "They're not safety guidelines, Hannah. They're terms of an agreement." The cabin fell quiet except for the crackling of the wood stove. Outside, I could hear wind moving through the aspens, but it sounded different now. Less like weather and more like whispers. "An agreement with what?" Grayson asked. Ted stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that were just becoming visible in the dawn light. "With the people who were here first, the ones who never left, just stepped sideways from where we could usually see them." "You're talking about Francisco," I said. "Francisco's one of them. Maybe their spokesperson, maybe just the one assigned to deal with us. I don't know their hierarchy." Ted turned back to face us. "What I know is that 40 years ago, after my survey team lost 3 people, I was approached." "By Francisco?" "By someone like him. Different face, same presence, same way of appearing and disappearing that shouldn't be possible." Ted sat back down, suddenly looking every one of his 67 years. "He told me the mountains would tolerate human presence under specific conditions, follow the paths they designated, travel in groups so no one could wander into places they shouldn't go, stay away from water sources where the boundaries were thinnest." Aubrey set down her coffee mug with a sharp click. "And you agreed to this?" "I agreed to test it, set up the guiding service as a way to control human access, make sure people followed the rules without knowing why they were really following them." Ted's voice was steady, but I could see the weight of decades in his eyes. 40 years, Hannah. 40 years of people following those 3 simple rules, and how many disappearances have we had? I thought about it. Before this week, maybe one every few years, and every single one broke at least one rule, wandered off alone, left the designated trails, went too close to water without backup. Ted pulled out a notebook filled with his careful handwriting. I've documented every incident. The pattern's consistent. So the missing hikers, Grayson said slowly, they're not really missing. They're payment, Ted finished, for the rest of us being allowed to walk in places that were never meant for humans. The word lingered there. Payment. As if people were currency in some deal I'd never agreed to be part of. That's insane, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Everything made sense now. The way Francisco had looked at me near Devil's Thumb, like he was evaluating something. The journal entries about guide patterns and schedules. The way he'd told Claire she wasn't ready yet, that she still had choices to make. Is it? Ted asked. You've seen him, Hannah. You've watched him appear and disappear in ways that don't follow physical laws. You've seen the evidence, packs that are dry when they should be wet, computer records that change themselves, people who exist one moment and are forgotten the next. I thought about Francisco standing on that boulder in the middle of the rushing stream, perfectly balanced, his voice somehow carrying clearly over the water's roar. What did he mean when he said the missing people serve the mountain now? I asked. Ted stayed quiet for a long moment. I don't know. I've never asked for details about what happens to them. Some questions are better left unasked. But they're not dead, Aubrey said. It wasn't really a question. I don't think so. Death is different. This is something else. A change of allegiance, maybe. Or purpose. Ted closed his notebook. What I know is that the arrangement has kept these mountains relatively safe for 4 decades. People can visit, experience the wilderness, go home with their memories and photos, as long as they follow the rules. And if they don't follow the rules, Grayson said, Francisco collects them. Francisco or others like him. I've seen at least 3 different ones over the years, though he's the most active. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the peaks now bathed in morning sunlight. The mountains appeared the same as they always had, beautiful, imposing, eternal. But now I knew they were watching back. Why are you telling us this? I asked, without turning around. Because things are changing, Ted said. More people every year, more pressure to open new trails, expand access. The old agreement is getting harder to maintain. And because I'm getting old, Hannah, someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to be ready to make the choice. I turned back to face him. What choice? Ted's pale blue eyes met mine, and I saw something there I'd never noticed before. Not just weariness, but a kind of peace that came from accepting things that couldn't be explained. Whether to keep the agreement going or let it end and see what happens when the mountains decide they've had enough of us. I stood at the Maroon Bells trailhead going through my gear, same routine as always, but everything felt different now. The first aid kit, emergency radio, extra water, they weren't just safety equipment anymore. They were tools for keeping up a treaty I'd never signed but somehow inherited. Hannah, right? A woman in her 50s approached, wearing the kind of expensive hiking outfit that screamed, I bought everything the outdoor store recommended. I'm Janet Morrison. We spoke on the phone about the group size? That's right. 8 people total today. I clipped my radio to my belt and tried to sound normal, professional. We'll stick together as one group, stay on the designated trail and... Hannah! Mickey Reese's voice cut through my standard speech. He jogged over from the parking area, camera already in hand, that same eager expression I remembered from 2 weeks ago. Great to see you again. I was hoping I'd get you as a guide. My stomach tightened. Of all the people to have in my group today, Mickey was probably the worst choice. His endless questions and need to pick apart every detail. I wasn't sure I could deal with that while trying to wrap my head around what Ted had just dropped on us. "Mickey," I managed. "Good to see you too." The rest of the group came together around the information board. A young couple from Texas, an older man traveling alone, 2 college friends from California, and Janet Morrison. 8 people, just like always. I went through my mental checklist, studying their faces as I explained the rules. Stay together at all times. No wandering off for photos or bathroom breaks without letting me know. Stay on the marked trail. The terrain off-trail can be unstable and dangerous. And don't go near water alone. The streams and lakes can be deceptive, with currents stronger than they appear. The words came out automatically, but now I heard them differently. Not safety guidelines, terms of an agreement. "Why no water access?" Mickey asked, pulling out his phone to take notes. "I've been researching the geological composition of this area, and the mineral content of the lakes should be fascinating to analyze." "Because I said so," I replied, sharper than I intended. "These aren't suggestions, they're requirements." Mickey blinked, clearly taken aback by my tone. Janet Morrison looked unhappy, probably wondering if she'd picked the wrong guide service. I forced myself to smile. "Sorry, long week. The rules exist for good reasons, and 40 years of guiding experience has proven they work. Let's head out." We started up the trail in the crisp morning air. Aspen leaves had turned fully golden now, creating a bright yellow roof overhead that should have been beautiful. Instead, I found myself checking the trees for scratches, listening for sounds that didn't belong. 20 feet up the trail I saw them, fresh marks on a pine tree, deep cuts in the bark that reached about 15 feet high. But now I knew what they were. Boundary markers, signs that we were entering territory that belonged to someone else. "Interesting," Mickey said, stopping beside me. "Those scratches look deliberate, too evenly spaced for animal damage. Maybe trail maintenance markings?" "Maybe," I said, urging him forward. "Keep up with the group." But Mickey was already pulling out his phone, snapping pictures of the marks from different angles. "Look how deep these go. Whatever made them has serious strength. And the height. What kind of gear would maintenance crews even use to get up there?" "Mickey." My voice carried a warning I hoped he'd recognize. "We need to keep moving." He looked at me strangely, but put away his phone. As we kept walking up the trail, I caught him looking back at that marked tree, his brain clearly trying to solve the puzzle. The walk to Cathedral Lake took an hour, filled with the usual tourist talk about work and vacation plans, but I barely paid attention. Every shadow between the trees might be hiding someone in a Hawaiian shirt. Every bird call could be something else completely. The forest felt different than I'd ever noticed before, like it was keeping an eye on us as we passed through. When we got to the lake, the tourists immediately spread out along the shore with their cameras. The water perfectly mirrored the surrounding peaks, creating that reflection effect that made everyone want pictures. "Remember, stay together," I called out, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. I was looking across the water when I spotted him. Francisco stood among the aspens on the far side of the lake, maybe 200 yards away. He wore that same bright Hawaiian shirt, the tropical pattern completely out of place against the mountain backdrop. But this time he wasn't trying to blend in with a tour group or pretending to be lost. He was just watching. I glanced around at my group. Mickey was crouched by the water's edge, probably testing mineral content. Janet Morrison was posing for selfies with the peaks in the background. The college friends were skipping stones. None of them seemed to notice the figure across the lake. When I looked back, Francisco raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or acknowledgement. Then he nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement that somehow conveyed understanding. He knew that I knew. I blinked, and he vanished. Not walking away into the trees, not stepping behind a trunk, just disappeared like he'd never been there at all. "Hannah?" Mickey appeared beside me, following my gaze across the water. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." The word slammed into me. Ghost. Was that what Francisco was? What the missing hikers had become? "I'm fine," I said automatically. "Just keeping an eye on everyone." But Mickey was looking at my face with that same focused intensity he brought to everything else. "You've been different today, more wound up, and those tree markings earlier. You knew what they were, didn't you?" I turned to face him completely. "Mickey, some things are better left alone." "But that's not how knowledge works," he said, his voice taking on the passionate tone he used when discussing his programming projects. "Information wants to be understood, patterns want to be decoded. If there's something happening up here that affects safety, the safety protocols work," I interrupted. 40 years of evidence proves they work. That's all you need to know." Mickey stared at me for a long moment. "You sound like you're trying to convince yourself as much as me." Before I could reply, Janet Morrison called out from the shoreline. "Hannah, how much longer at the lake? I want to make sure we have time for photos at the other spots." 10 more minutes, I called back, grateful for the interruption. As the group took their final photos and started packing up their gear, I found myself staring across the lake one more time. The aspens moved in a breeze I couldn't feel, their golden leaves bright in the afternoon sun. Pretty and calm, like a postcard of Colorado wilderness, but now I knew something was watching from those trees, something that had been here long before the first human ever walked into this valley, something that put up with our visits as long as we stuck to the rules. The hike back to the trailhead went smoothly. Mickey asked fewer questions, though I saw him taking pictures of more tree markings along the way. The rest of the group talked about their experience, already making plans for their next Colorado trip. At the parking lot, I went through my usual end-of-tour routine, reminding everyone to check for ticks, suggesting other local attractions, accepting tips with professional gratitude. But part of me kept thinking about Ted's words. Someone needs to be ready to make the choice. What choice? Keep guiding and enforcing rules for a treaty I'd never signed? Or walk away from the mountains entirely, leave someone else to figure out the balance between human access and old agreements? As the tourists got into their cars and drove away, Mickey hung around by his rental car, clearly wanting to ask more questions. I pretended to be busy with my gear until he finally gave up and left. Alone in the parking lot, I sat in my truck and looked up at the peaks. The maroon bells rose into the late afternoon sky, their red rock faces catching the golden light. 14,000 feet of stone and snow that had stood here for millions of years, long before humans existed, long before we decided we had the right to walk wherever we wanted. But as I watched my group drive away, 8 people who would go home with photos and memories and stories about their Colorado adventure, I understood why Ted had stayed all these years. Someone had to keep the balance. Someone had to make sure the rules were followed, even if the people following them never understood why. My phone buzzed with a text from Aubrey. "Call me when you get a chance. Good news about the certification program." I drove home through the twisting mountain roads, mulling over decisions and duties and the burden of secrets I'd never wanted. The sun was dropping behind the peaks, turning the sky orange and pink, the kind of view tourists pay thousands to capture. At home, I called Aubrey back. "Hannah, great news," she said without preamble. "The Park Service approved your suggestion about mandatory guide certification. They're implementing it next season." My suggestion? The enhanced safety protocols you mentioned. Ted's 3 rules are now officially required training for anyone guiding in the wilderness areas. They're calling it the Colorado Wilderness Safety Certification. I dropped onto my couch. They're making Ted's rules mandatory? Exactly. And get this, Grayson already signed up to help teach the course. Apparently, he's become a real convert to the safety-first approach. Aubrey's voice carried a note of amusement. Who would have thought? After we hung up, I sat in my living room as night crept in outside. Ted's rules were becoming official policy, which meant the treaty would stay in place even if individual guides didn't understand what they were really enforcing. Grayson was helping to train them, which meant he'd accepted the reality of what we were actually doing up there. Around 9 o'clock, I decided to drive up to the scenic overlook above town. I needed space to think, and looking out over the valley always helped me sort through things. But when I pulled into the small parking area, I found I wasn't alone. Ted's truck sat at the far end, and I could see two figures standing at the stone barrier that marked the edge of the overlook. Ted's familiar outline was easy to spot, but the second figure made my breath catch. Francisco stood beside him, both of them looking out over the valley as the final light disappeared from the western sky. They weren't talking, just standing together like old friends keeping a quiet watch. I stayed in my truck, watching them watch the mountains. After a few minutes, Francisco turned slightly and looked directly at my vehicle. Even from 50 yards away, I could feel his stare. He raised one hand in that same greeting I'd seen at the lake, then stepped back from the barrier. By the time I blinked, he was gone. Ted stayed at the overlook for another few minutes, then walked slowly back to his truck. As he drove past me, he raised his hand in a brief wave but didn't stop. I sat there alone, looking out over the valley where lights were starting to sparkle in the darkness below. Somewhere down there, tourists were editing their photos and posting them online, sharing their mountain adventure with friends who'd never understand what they'd really experienced. And somewhere up in those dark peaks, old agreements were being honored by people who'd learned to accept that some truths were bigger than human understanding. I started my truck and drove home, already planning tomorrow's route and thinking about the rules I'd teach my next group. Stay together, stay on the trail, don't go near water alone. Simple words that kept the balance between two worlds, kept safe by guides who'd learned that some responsibilities choose you rather than the other way around.